They said it could not be done. A British bomber designed in the 1950s for nuclear strikes over Europe was tasked with flying nearly 8,000 miles round-trip to bomb an airfield in the South Atlantic without guaranteed refueling, without margin for error, and without the option to fail. The Avro Vulcan was not designed for conventional bombing at extreme range or for crossing open ocean without diversion airfields. It was operating with Cold War era navigation systems stretched to their absolute limits. Yet on April 30th, 1982, the mission launched anyway. The target was Port Stanley Airport in the Falkland Islands, which had been seized weeks earlier by Argentine forces. The staging point was Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic, situated 3,900 miles away. Navigation margins were razor-thin and fuel calculations allowed no cushion. If anything went wrong, there would be nowhere to land. This mission was not about stealth or speed, but about reach and whether Britain could still strike where others believed it was impossible. Welcome to Hidden Valor. To understand why Operation Black Buck shocked observers, you need to understand what the Vulcan was and critically what it had become by 1982. The Avro Vulcan entered RAF service in 1956 as part of Britain's V-Force nuclear deterrent. Its distinctive delta wing gave it an imposing presence, designed for high-altitude nuclear strikes against Soviet targets in Europe. By 1982, that world had vanished as surface-to-air missiles ended the era of high-altitude bombing. The Vulcan had adapted to low-level penetration tactics that stressed its aging airframe. 3 squadrons remained operational, numbers 44, 50, and 101, but all were scheduled for disbandment by July 1982. The Vulcan was in its final months of service when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982. RAF planners examined their options for striking Port Stanley and faced a stark reality. They had no modern long-range bombers. The Vulcan was the only aircraft capable of carrying 21 1,000-pound bombs, enough conventional ordnance to crater an airfield runway. However, the Vulcan's unrefueled range was roughly 2,500 miles, while Port Stanley was 3,900 miles from the nearest British airfield at Ascension Island. Even with aerial refueling capability, the mission parameters were unprecedented. Air-to-air refueling equipment had been removed from most Vulcans years earlier when they transitioned away from long-range nuclear operations. Crews had not practiced conventional bombing or aerial refueling for several years. Everything had to be relearned, reinstalled, and tested in weeks. American planners watched with professional concern, viewing the margins as uncomfortably thin. The RAF needed to create a massive refueling chain involving Victor tankers refueling other Victors, which would then refuel the Vulcan. Some tankers existed solely to enable other tankers to continue progress. It was operationally complex and inherently fragile. One mechanical failure, missed rendezvous, or weather deviation could cause the entire mission to collapse. There was no Plan B, no carrier strike capability that could reach that far, and no alternative platform. Inside the planning rooms, crews confronted the reality that navigation would rely on 1970s-era inertial systems with no GPS, satellite updates, or digital corrections. Over 3,900 miles of mostly open ocean, small navigation errors would compound dangerously. Fuel calculations were brutal, with every drop matching and every contingency consuming range. The bomber would operate beyond safety margins, betting everything on perfect execution. This was a methodical engineering of risk, calculating how to push a Cold War relic past every design limitation. The Vulcan would succeed through planning, discipline, and human precision under pressure. Everyone involved realized this mission would prove whether Britain could still project power independently or if that era had passed. On the evening of April 30th, 1982, at a wide-awake airfield on Ascension Island, 13 aircraft prepared for takeoff. This force included 2 Vulcan bombers and 11 Victor tankers. Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers commanded Vulcan XM-607, the reserve aircraft, while Squadron Leader John Reeve piloted XM-598, the primary bomber. The plan called for Withers to fly 4 hours as backup and then return to Ascension. Shortly after takeoff, Reeve reported that the cabin would not pressurize due to a split seal on the captain's window, forcing XM-598 to turn back. A radio call reached Withers in XM-607 stating he was now the primary aircraft. His crew faced a 3,900-mile journey to the target and 3,900 miles back. As the formation pushed south, the complexity of the refueling plan became reality. Tankers transferred fuel to other tankers and turned back toward Ascension with barely enough fuel to make it home. The margin for error collapsed with each successful handoff. By the third refueling, the Vulcan was committed, as turning back would not guarantee safety. Then came the storm, forcing crews to fly through turbulence at night while maintaining close formation for refueling, which burned more fuel than planned. When Victor XL-189, piloted by Squadron Leader Bob Tuxford, arrived for a critical transfer, they had less fuel to give than expected. Withers and his crew received only half what they needed. Tuxford had given more than he could spare and barely made it back to Ascension, leaving XM-607 dangerously short. Withers gathered his crew, including Navigator Flight Lieutenant Gordon Graham, Radar Operator Flight Lieutenant Robert Wright, Co-Pilot Peter Taylor, Air Electronics Officer Hugh Pryor, and Air-to-Air Refueling Instructor Flight Lieutenant Richard Russell. Withers told them that despite being short on fuel, they had come too far to turn back. The decision was made at 400 Zulu on May 1, 1982. After flying for 15 hours, XM-607 approached Port Stanley from the northeast. The runway stretched below in the pre-dawn darkness. The bomb release was conventional, dropping 21 1,000-pound bombs in a diagonal line across the airfield. One struck the runway directly, cratering it near the center, and Withers transmitted the code word superfuse. The return flight required one final refueling scheduled off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. The Vulcan limped north carrying less fuel than Withers had ever flown with. When the tanker appeared, the relief was profound. After 15 hours and 45 minutes airborne, XM-607 landed back at Ascension Island, completing the longest bombing raid in aviation history. By the time Vulcan XM-607 shut down its engines, the tactical result was clear but modest. The one runway crater at Port Stanley Airport was repaired by Argentine forces within 24 hours. The Vulcans never permanently denied the airfield to enemy aircraft, yet the strategic impact was immediate and profound. Argentina had assumed the islands were too far for Britain to reach conventionally, but Black Buck shattered that assumption. Argentine commanders, fearing strikes on mainland air bases, kept their frontline fighters, including Mirage 3s and Super Attenders, in northern Argentina rather than deploying them to the Falklands. This fundamentally changed the air war, as British Sea Harriers faced mostly A-4 Skyhawks and older aircraft instead of Argentina's best fighters. 7 Black Buck missions followed, with Black Buck 5 and 6 targeting radar installations with anti-radiation missiles. On Black Buck 6, Vulcan XM-597 suffered a refueling probe failure and had to divert to Rio de Janeiro, where it was impounded by Brazilian authorities until the war ended. 5 missions successfully attacked their targets. For American military planners, Black Buck provided sobering lessons. The RAF demonstrated that extreme range operations were possible, but at an enormous cost requiring massive tanker support, perfect weather, flawless execution, and acceptance of risks modern doctrine would reject. It was operationally inefficient, yet worked. Black Buck proved that reach is about the will to marshal logistics, planning, and human endurance to act at distances others believe impossible. It stands as a testament to Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, who was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, his crew who flew into history on a mission they were not supposed to survive, and the Vulcan bomber that reached beyond every expectation.